The delegitimization, cultural hijacking, and appropriation of the Black Hebrew Israelites' identity and culture have been ongoing for approximately 2,000 years, with various phases and intensities. Here's a brief overview. Ancient Era, 500 BCE, 500 CE. The initial suppression of the Hebrew Israelites' identity began with the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, followed by the Roman Empire's destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Medieval Era, 500–1500 CE. During the Middle Ages, European Christianity perpetuated anti-Jewish sentiment, leading to forced conversions, expulsions, and the Inquisition. Colonial Era, 1500–1800 CE. European powers colonized Africa, enslaving and forcibly converting Black Hebrew Israelites to Christianity, erasing their cultural identity. Modern Era, 1800–2000 CE. The rise of European Zionism led to the establishment of the State of Israel, further marginalizing Black Hebrew Israelites' claims to their ancestral heritage.
I said 92% of the people that say that they are Jews today are in fact Ashkenazi, sons of Gomer, so thereby are the synagogue of Satan, they who say they are Jews and are not. So who are the real Jews? That's the question that has been posed to me many times over the past months. And there's really two answers to that question. And I'm going to be thorough today because I need to be thorough, because when you speak about this, it's going to upset a lot of people. So we're going to have to take our time in the scripture, so bear with me. Two answers to that question. One, I already addressed in the rotting stick of false restoration and the synagogue of Satan teaching. And that is, who are the true Jews?
I'm going to let scripture and history speak for itself, because in order for any nation to be considered the chosen, or for any nation to be considered the true children of Israel, they have to fulfill all of the curses that are spoken of in Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 15 through 68, as well as Leviticus chapter 26 verses 14 through 46. And the question is, does the 1948 nation of Israel fulfill all of the curses that are spoken of in scripture, or do they only fulfill some of them? In order for any group of people to claim to be the chosen people of so-called God, they have to fulfill all of the curses, because long story short, the children of Israel did not adhere to the commandments, and because of that, all of the curses fell upon them. But the question is, just who did the curses fall upon, and does today's Israel fit that description of scripture? Like I said, for any group of people to suggest that they are the chosen, they must fit all of the curses that are spoken of in Deuteronomy, or Dabarim chapter 28 verses 15 through 68, and Vayikra Leviticus chapter 26 verses 14 through 46. They must fit the curses where they will serve their enemies in a land that they do not know. They must have had their children sold to other people. They would be enslaved again in ships and sold into slavery. They would have poverty, sickness, disease, and they would be war-stricken all over. They would have torture and anguish. And these people that scripture is talking about, they would forget who they are. And these group of people must fit this description. They would be in a strange land that is not their own, and they would have strangers to be their head while they are the tail. I am paraphrasing what scripture actually says. There would be great plagues to come upon these people. There would be distress, heartache, and constant pain. These people would be discriminated against, and no one would be able to help them. There would be yokes of iron around their necks, and they would speak a strange language, and they would not know who they are. And the question is, And the question we should be asking ourselves today is, according to scripture and according to history, does this group of people fit that description that is spoken of in scripture? Do these group of people who claim to be the chosen, who claim to be the Jews, do they fit the description of the curses? Because if they do not, then there is a giant deception that is going on. But like I said, before we go any further, let's let history speak
We're
for
going to
itself.
look and track now the migration patterns of the regal merchant class of the house of Judah. Because now we can see that the Caucasians are not pure white races, but a mixture of Asians that lived on the Russian steppes. Asians in the Caucasus Mountains, right? Caucasians. Ashkenazi Khazars. The Ashkenazi, they who say they are Jews and are not, are Caucasians. Khazarian Mongols. That's the truth. And you can check that box. They who say they are Jews and are not. But we're going to look into history. Even when you look at, say, a country like Ethiopia in Africa, and you dig into the history of Menelik I and Menelik II, you'll understand that they were descendants of King Solomon. Menelik meaning from the Melech, from the king, from the king. But what about Egypt? What about Mitzrayim, Egypt? What about Egypt? The pharaohs were black. They weren't white. They were black. Egypt is Mitzrayim, and it means burnt face or black. The ancients referred to their country as Kemet, which has been written in a variety of ways. Kemet, Kemit, Kem, Al-Kem, and it literally means the black land, or the land of the blacks, Mitzrayim. How did Moshe Rabbeinu go undetected for 40 years if he was a Caucasian in the land of the black faces? How did he go undetected for 40 years? How did Joseph's brothers not recognize him in the land of the black faces if he was a white man? Can you tell me that? Noah called his son Ham, in the Hebrew, Ham, Chet Mem Sofit, and it means hot. Kemet and Ham are the same words in the Hebrew, which represented the coloring of the people of Mitzrayim, Egypt. What happens if something stays hot for a long time? It burns and turns black, right? So in Exodus chapter 2, Shemot chapter 2, verse 19, Moshe was described as a Mitzri, which means a black face, from the land of the blacks. They didn't say that he was a Mitzri Laban, a Mitzri Laban. What was Laban? Remember Laban? He was an albino. He was white, an albino. And you can see that in Africa today. There are albinos. But he would have been described, if he was white, as a Mitzri Laban. But he wasn't. Which would have meant he was an albino African. But he wasn't. Just like Yaakov's uncle was an albino. You see, the ancient Egyptians were a Kemetic people. They were black. In 1965, the former president of Egypt, Gamal Abdul Nasser, said he couldn't respect the present Jews in Israel because they left Israel black and they came back white. Because they were Caucasians when they returned, a Turkic Mongol Asians from the Caucasus Mountains, the Russian steppes. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5. I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. I am black The Hebrew word there is shachar ha-anya. It literally translates to, I am dark-skinned. Strong's number, and I don't use Strong's numbers very often, but there's going to be pushback. Strong's number 7838, shachar, from Strong's number 7835, dusky. So the word shachar means dusky. And if you look in the concise Oxford English Dictionary in the 10th edition, dusky means darkish in color, euphemistic of a person black and dark-skinned. And in the Old English Dictionary, it says tending to blackness. Song of Solomon's 5, verse 11. His head is as the most pure gold, meaning it's royal, it's regal, he's kingly, he's wearing a crown. His locks are curly and as black as a raven. King Solomon, Melech Shlomo, was black. And only blacks have locks, not Caucasians, no matter what Rapunzel or what was the other one? Goldilocks would say, right? Look at Bathsheba in the Hebrew. Bet Tab Shin Bet Ain, daughter of Sheba. She was the black daughter of Sheba, whose line goes back to Sheba, who was the son of Cush. Cush, who produced the Nilotic black races. Look at this, Bereshit, Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mitzrayim and Put and Canaan, and the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Savta, Ramah, Savtecha, and the sons of Ramah, Sheba and Dedan. And now you're going to say, well, if that's true of Solomon, what about Melech David? What about King David? We know that he was an Anglo because he had ruddy skin, right? Isn't that what the scripture says? Of course. He was Caucasian. No. 1 Samuel 17, verse 42. And when the Philistine looked out and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and of fair countenance. And then you can just move on. But I just don't want to move on. Because when you look at the Hebrew for ruddy is Adomi. Adomi, and it's spelled Aleph, Dalet, Mem, Nun, Yod. And it means reddish black, as in reddish black soil. The reddish black soil connected to the land. And if you don't believe that, Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, Bereshit 4:10. And he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's dam, blood, cries out to me from the ground. So now here we've got the word play. Dam is blood. Adamah is ground. Adomi is ruddy. We're talking mahogany in color, reddish black. Malcolm X, what was his nickname? Red. Detroit Red. Why? Because he was ruddy in his appearance. He was called Detroit Red. He was mahogany ruddy in appearance. So we have to dig in further. Because if King David was an Ashkenazi, white Jew with a reddish complexion, he would have been described as Laban, an albino, but he wasn't. So King David looked more like Malcolm X than he did King Henry VIII, right? But I mean, the DVDs we give our children, right? Oh my goodness, like you were saying, the Israelites have British accents, right? My goodness, it's outrageous. But look at ancient Egypt hieroglyphics, and they are ruddy. The Egyptians have got ruddy black skin. mahogany skin, reddish-black complexions. You see, one of King Solomon's sons was later taken to Ethiopia by the Queen of Sheba, whose son had descendants reigning in Ethiopia until when? Until the Ashkenazi, those who say they are Jews and are not, came in and dethroned Haile Selassie in 1974. And that's where we get the Rasta movement, of course, from Ethiopia. Because then, after they dethroned Haile Selassie in 1974, then who did they bring in 1984 to get rid of any of those connected back to biblical Israel? Of course, they bring in Sir Bob Geldof a decade later with his Live Aid migration moving of people for the Ashkenazi communists, and moves everybody from the plateaus into the Live Aid feeding camps underneath Ashkenazi communist control. We already spoke about that earlier at Sukkot. Even the Ethiopian Jews, they're called the Falashas, meaning those that are black. Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, the daughters, my dispersed ones. That's the Queen of Sheba and her sons migrated and dispersed to Ethiopia. Lamentations chapter 4 verse 2. The precious sons of Zion are comparable to fine gold. Verse 8, their visage is blacker than coal. And the concise Oxford English Dictionary, the 10th edition, tells us that visage is a poetic literary of a person's face with reference to the form of their features. A person's facial expression is what? Blacker than coal. You start to connect the language and you start to see. Bereshit, Genesis chapter 9, verse 27. We have got the Ashkenazi sons of Japheth that have infiltrated into the land and are what? Have got the whole world convinced. The whole world convinced that they are sons of Shem. But look what it says in Bereshit chapter 9 verse 27. It actually tells you that Yahweh, who is omnipotent, it is his will because he has actually deceived them into doing this. They are so deceived into doing this. Look at Genesis 9:27. Elohim will entice and deceive. The Hebrew word there is patah. Patah. He will deceive Japheth, Ashkenaz, the sons of Japheth, and he will dwell, that means Ashkenaz will dwell in the tents of the Shemites. Is that what's happening today? Has he deceived the Ashkenazi so much, those from the Russian steppes, the Caucasians, he's deceived them so much that they're actually dwelling in the place where the real Shemites should dwell? Genesis 9 verse 27. You see, Yahweh is the one that has deceived. He has enticed Japheth. Patah, deceived, enticed. He's deceived and enticed the Ashkenazi Jews into believing that they're the Jews, and they've built the Zionist state of Israel today. Lamentations 4, 7, and 8. And this is really hard for people to see in Scripture, because predominantly it has been the Caucasians that have been in charge of the Scriptures, right? For millennia. Lamentations 5:10. Our skin was black like an oven. Job 30 verse 30. My skin is black upon me and my bones are burned with heat. Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. And Yahweh shall bring you into Mitzrayim, Egypt again with ships. And the way of which I said to you, you shall see it no more again. And there you shall be sold to your enemies for slaves and female slaves, and no man shall buy you. And that is what happened to the regal class of the house of Judah. And I want to give you a brief history. I won't go into it too much, but I can't just make that statement because there'll be people that'll push back. But I want to give you a brief history on slavery. I was just amazed, I got to tell you. I mean, when you come to America and you talk to people about slavery, you can talk to black people about slavery, white people about slavery, and they'll give you all this history on slavery, and it only goes back to the 16th and the 17th century. And you're like, don't they teach you the history of slavery? Why? Ask the bloody question. Why are they only teaching you the history of slavery as far back as the 16th and the 17th century? Why are they only going that far back? Because they don't want you to go farther back than that, because then you'll actually find out the truth. But from the 16th and 17th century, we'll teach you about slavery. You've got to go further back. And you've got to understand and question, why do they do this throughout the whole of America, in all the public schools? Why do they only go back as far as the 16th and the 17th century to talk about slavery? We've got to go further back than that. Because Islam designed infernal slavery. And then the Ashkenazi Khazars, those who say they are Jews and are not, are the ones that marketed it, and the regal Negro nomads exiled from the kingdom of Judah were the main recipients of it at the hands of the indigenous black Africans. Because you've got to understand, the regal class of the house of Judah came down from Israel, and they came into the land of the black Africans. And the black Africans resented the regal class of the house of Judah in their land because they had laws, they had customs, they had civility, and they were a regal class of Negro that came down into Africa. And later on, it was the Ashkenazi, the Islamic slave traders as well, that then worked together with the indigenous black Africans to enslave the regal house of Judah. This is what we've got to understand, but you've got to go back before the 16th century to understand the roots of it. So we're going to see, as we dig into this, where this slavery came from, because it was really a system that was very, very well crafted. There was Islamic masters, and there were white Ashkenazi Khazar ship owners. There were the buyers and the sellers. And they're not going to fill you in on all of this, but really you've got a 4-tier system. Number one, you have the Negro nomads that were exiled from the kingdom of Judah. Number two, you had indigenous black African hunters that resented the regal Negro nomads that had come into their territory with their own customs, with their own laws that were different and would not assimilate into their tribal culture. They were their own tribe. They were the regal house of Judah. And number three, you had Islamic trappers that worked with the indigenous black Africans to trap the regal Negro house of Judah. And then you had them sell them to the Ashkenazi ship merchants, along with many Portuguese and British Ashkenazi. You see, it's just like Al-Qaeda today. Or is it ISIS? Or is it ISIL? Or is it IS? I mean, right? Let's just change the name as much as possible to throw you all off so you really don't know what's going on. Let's keep switching the identity to hide the people. Why don't we just keep renaming you? Are you Negro? Oh, no, you're not Negro. No, you're colored. No, you're not colored. You're African American. And this is what they name you. The slavers name you this. Because I know a white guy who grew up in South Africa. And he now lives in America. He is an African American, and more African American than most. Do you see how African American is a misnomer? It's a misnomer. Don't check that box. It's a title given to blacks by democratic slavers. Okay? Let's be real. They want you to check the box, just like they want the Anglo-Saxon to check the Caucasian box. It's not true. So, again, we've got the 4-tier system. Number 1, we have the regal Negro nomadic class that are exiled from the kingdom of Judah. They are their own royal tribe in Africa. Then, number 2, we have the native black African trackers. They're going to track them down. And number 3, we have the Islamic trappers, because between 650 of the Common Era and 1900 of the Common Era, 10 to 20 million people were enslaved by the Arab slave traders. Over 20 million enslaved Africans were delivered through the Trans-Sahara route to the Islamic world. Can you get your head around that? That's not even touching the Americas. Over 80 million more blacks died at the hands of Islam en route. And number 4, we have Ashkenazi Khazar Jewish ship merchants. And of course, the Portuguese and the British Ashkenazi were the main buyers. Islam and the Ashkenazi, those that say that they are Jews and are not, were the main sellers. Does that make sense? You've got to dig into this further. We have the 2 tiers right there. We have the Islamic trappers, and then we have the Ashkenazi ship merchants. You see, the Romans, they were globalist slavers. They were globalists then and now. They just migrated to Gaul, Ashkenazi, the sellers, and Britain, the British, of course, the buyers. German Jewry and British Jewry, where have they gone to? Well, they've descended upon Wall Street, upon Hollywood and Washington, D.C., as we see it right now, just to fuel this cataclysmic final war of globalism, which is none other than renaming colonialism. And this is the world that you and I live in.
All that being said, what happened to the real people of Judah in 70 AD, following the siege and destruction of Jerusalem? The ones who weren't captured by the Romans and killed or enslaved escaped. But where did they go? First, you have to understand that whenever trouble arose, such as severe famine in the land, our forefathers and mothers were known to migrate in order to avoid it. There are 3 famous accounts of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob heading south when famine struck at different periods in each of their lifetimes. Abraham and Jacob went all the way south to Egypt, but Isaac went as far as Gerar. And let's not forget Joseph and Mary, who also fled south to Egypt with Yeshua to escape trouble. These acts are all somewhat prophetic, as they are a major clue as to what happened to the people of Judah following the destruction of Jerusalem. In his book, From Babylon to Timbuktu, author and historian Rudolph R. Windsor, a true Hebrew, writes, in the year 65 BC, the Roman armies under General Pompey captured Jerusalem. In 70 AD, General Vespasian and his son, Titus, put an end to the Jewish state with great slaughter. During the period of the military governors of Palestine, many outrages and atrocities were committed against the residue of the people. During the period from Pompey to Julius, it has been estimated that over 1 million Jews fled into Africa, fleeing from Roman persecution and slavery. the slave markets were full of black Jewish slaves. After the fall of the Carthaginian metropolis in North Africa, Roman power became dominant in the Barbary states. The pagans and the Romans attacked the Jews indiscriminately, both the Jewish soldiers and the uninvolved peaceful population. As a result of this merciless attack, many Jews fled to those parts of Northwest Africa known as Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Mauritania. Many other Jews fled to the areas where Rome did not have any jurisdiction. This was to the region of the South, the Sahara Desert, and the Sudan. Windsor also tells us on page 86 and 87 that more descendants of Judah fled to the west coast of Africa in the 7th century after the Visigoths assumed power and began to suppress Hebrew customs with forced baptisms to Christianity. Windsor cites many credible sources to make his points. Among them is Joseph J. Williams, a 20th century historian who, in his 1930 book Hebrewisms of West Africa, wrote, "Whatever may be thought of the more or less mythological traditions connected with the earliest Jews in North Africa, it is now practically an established fact that a Jewish nation, Jewish at least in faith and perhaps too in origin, long held sway south of the Sahara." Now, while Joseph Williams, who is Caucasian and Jesuit, does provide meaningful and factual info that pertains to the descendants of the ancient Hebrew Israelites, he does so with a degree of reluctance, and the book is written through the lens of what I would call a racist and white supremacist viewpoint. Because despite all the evidence of the true descendants of Judah and Israel as a whole being black, Williams and his sources try to brush that aside and conclude that white Jews, who they blindly claim are the originals, must have somehow lost their color by interbreeding with blacks who thereafter assimilated their culture, for which there is absolutely no evidence. That said, Hebrewisms of West Africa is full of valuable information as regards the wanderings of the Hebrews following the flight from Judea, and it also gives great insight into the further scattering of our ancestors, as certain customs practiced in West Africa by our Hebrew ancestors found their way to islands like Jamaica, Haiti, the Virgin Islands, and many other places following the slave trade. So, having fled their homeland as prophesied, there our ancestors were, charting new territory in Africa and trying to carry on their Hebrew traditions in a new land, but not as savages or uncivilized barbarians. In fact, Rudolph Windsor tells us in his book, "The black Jews had an advantage over the African tribes. They carried their culture, history, laws, and written records with them. This assured them a constant precedent for the development of a higher social organization. Because of the stability of the black Jewish culture, the Jews were not absorbed into the autochthonous or native population. In fact, the Jews absorbed some of the native tribes. The Jews made use of every opportunity. They were an industrious and skillful people. In the Jewish Ghanaian states were found kings, princes, governors, generals, secretaries, treasurers, revenue agents, judges, architects, engineers, doctors, jewelers, sculptors, masons, carpenters, painters of art, goldsmiths, leatherworkers, potters, armorers, saddlers, blacksmiths, agriculturists, etc. The survivors of the Roman siege of Jerusalem were able to flee that terror and carry on in a new land. But the relative peace our ancestors were afforded by escaping to Africa was broken by the Arab slave trade, which affected not only Hebrews, but men, women, and children from many other peoples that were usually of the lowest classes. The Eastern Arab slave trade, in particular, involved women and young girls, and a strict ratio of 2 women for each man was maintained. The Arab slave trade, as horrible as it was, eventually gave way to something much worse with the arrival of the Portuguese. Portugal broke from Arab rule somewhere between the 12th and 13th centuries and slowly rose to power. Because of this small European country, slavery would soon go from including people of lower classes from different ethnicities to being forced mainly on so-called blacks from the tribe of Judah. In the early 15th century, Portuguese shipbuilding in Lisbon and Porto adapted to the times, and the result was the caravel, a light and fast aerodynamic vessel that allowed Portuguese mariners to travel south along Africa's Atlantic coast in order to reach the gold-producing regions of sub-Saharan West Africa. After establishing several trading posts and colonies in the region, other markets began to open up, such as the lucrative commerce in India, and overseas expansion resulted from Portugal's many trade networks. The Portuguese became heavily active in slave trading in Africa around 1445, after they discovered the Cape Verde Islands and settled there. Slavery was used to fuel their expanding empire, and slave trafficking became integral to their enterprise. When it became apparent that slavery was big business, a law had to be created to protect it. Thus, the sitting Pope, Pope Nicholas V, issued a papal bull, the strongest command of a pope, titled Romanos Pontifex, Latin for the Roman Pontiff. He issued the bull to King Alfonso V of Portugal on January 8, 1455, and it allowed the king to, and I quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. This was basically a license and go-ahead for King Alfonso, who alone was personally named in the papal bull, to send vessels to search out, capture, vanquish, subdue, and enslave Hebrews, particularly the people of Judah, whose existence, kingdom, and territory they were well aware of. The people of Judah were their primary concern, in fact, and they are the so-called Negroes who were rounded up and scattered throughout the four corners of the earth, just as Yeshua said they would be, back in Luke 21, verse 24.
They will be killed by the sword or sent away as captives to all the nations of the world.
And this also coincides with the curse of Deuteronomy 28, verse 64.
For Yah will scatter you among all the nations, from one end of the earth to the other.
When I say they were aware of who Judah was, I'm not conjecturing. Proof is in the record. If you do a Google search and type in a new and accurate map of Negro land, a list of results will pop up. As of the date of this recording, Swain.com still works. Click on it and a page will open up showing a 1747 map of West Africa by 18th century English map engraver Emmanuel Bowen. And then click on the image of the map itself. Move your mouse pointer to the area that is now present-day Ghana and click on it to enlarge the map. Click it again and you will clearly see that what is now called Ghana was once the slave coast, which the map maker labeled the Kingdom of Judah, dropping the H at the end. This is where many of the people of Judah were shipped from, like sardines in a can. Yet today, the elites and their paid professors would have you believe that we are Africans or Hamites, when in truth we are Shemites. They themselves know this to be a fact. In Zondervan's Compact Bible Dictionary, for instance, the definition for Ham reads as follows. Ham, the youngest son of Noah, born probably 96 years before the flood, and one of 8 persons to live through the flood. He became the progenitor of the dark races, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. They say not the Negroes because Shem is the progenitor or father of the Negroes. Though both lines are comprised of so-called blacks, Africans and so-called African Americans are not the same. We are Hebrews and they are Hamites. But there are still many Hebrews in Africa, however. But getting back to our history, despite the papal bull pertaining solely to the King of Portugal, that didn't stop other empires and nations from getting in on the action. Over the centuries, Spain, Britain, France, the Dutch, Canada, the United States, and many African countries participated in the transatlantic slave trade. And this fulfills certain prophecies, such as Psalm 83, which I urge you to read with your eyes open. And Joel 3 verse 6.
You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, so they could take them far from their homeland.
The sad fact is, Psalm 83 is still in full effect, as our collective enemies are still conspiring to keep us in the dark as concern our true identity, and they continue to miseducate us. They really mean to wipe out the memory of the people of Israel from the face of the earth. But Yah is not going to let that happen. and this documentary is merely one step toward that effort. The present situation we are in is solely due to our forefathers failing to keep the covenant law of Yah, and it falls to us in this generation to right that wrong. And Yah said that this would happen in our day.
But I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and nations. Then in the nations where you have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me, how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes, which have lusted after their idols. They will loathe themselves for the evil they have done and for all their detestable practices, and they will know that I am Yah. I did not threaten in vain to bring this calamity on them.
You see, we, the people of Israel, are not born deserving of that name. We are born as Jacobs, or supplanters and schemers. But to truly earn the right to be called Israel, we, like our father Jacob, will have to be faithful and wrestle with Yah until we are overcomers. Those of us who do this will be the ones who will truly be called Israel and form the remnant of the kingdom.